Let's talk a little bit about the basic principles of map design. So map design is an iterative process. If you're not familiar with the term, it means that there are iterations. In other words, there are versions where you continually work through improving and modifying and changing your process until you reach a point where there is no additional improvement for additional change, and that's sort of when you've reached your goal. And we look at that process like this. We're going to start out with an objective. That objective is going to lead us to select data, which we will then arrange based on our objective. Once we arrange that data, we will symbolize it based on our objective. That will lead us to a basic output of a map, which we will review relative to our objective. And we will figure out things that we like and dislike about it, and we will make changes. In other words, we will edit based on our objective and start the process around, because once we make those edits, after we've sort of fixed that initial map, we might add more data, or maybe we take data out. It's not always just running around the outside. From that objective, we might look at the data that's available and say, hey, we're going to have to modify our objective. It can go both ways because we don't have the necessary data to do what we want. Or maybe once you arrange it, you're like, this isn't going to show us what we need. Or maybe, wow, this looks really interesting. It's not exactly what our objective is, but this is important, so maybe we change the objective to affect what we see or how we symbolize it. Or as we go through the review process, as we make edits, as our audience changes, so much can go into it. But ultimately, we're going to run this little ring around the rosy game here of finding data, putting it in the map, changing the symbology, looking at the total product, making changes, and going around and around again until we end up with a map that we think meets our objective. So what is the map objective? It's the first important design step, but there are 4 key questions that you need to answer when you come up with your objective. What is the purpose? Who is the audience? What is the medium? And what conditions will it be viewed? Maps serve a lot of purposes. They may be something as simple as locating things, navigating. It could be for compiling information, convincing somebody of your position, comparing 2 different locations, or analyzing some patterns, or any number of things. Who is your audience? Think about who's going to be viewing the map. If you're making a map for 3rd graders versus college students, that's an entirely different map. Think about the subject matter, what we're talking about. Think about the educational attainment of your audience. And general with maps, what is the capacity of the people who are going to be viewing it to understand it? Do they have special requirements? For example, if you're making a really complicated map that you're going to display it, for example, maybe a retirement community. Perhaps you want to reevaluate the use of small font because older people will at times have more difficulty reading fine print, and so larger text might be a big improvement to your map. Similarly, a wonderful color map is great, but what if your audience has multiple people who suffer from some variation of color blindness? What about the medium of the map? Is it going to be a paper map? Is it something that's going to be in a written report, a document, a PDF? Is it going to be a poster? Is it going to be a small wall map or a big wall map? These are questions you need to be thinking about when you're designing it. If it's an electronic file, is it going to be a PDF or a GIF? What's the formats? Are there any file size restrictions? How are you going to deliver it? Can it be zipped? Is it compressible? Think about the computers that are going to be looking at this. What are the size? What types of computers? If you're using an overhead projector, how quality is the projector? Does it lead the colors out? I can tell you firsthand experience in graduate school. The first time you do a presentation working on a master's or a PhD before all the students in your program, you will find out really quickly that the colors on your computer screen do not match the colors on the overhead projectors most of the time. And what matters is the color on the overhead projector in front of all the other students and faculty, not the color that shows up on your monitor at the front of the room where you're speaking from, behind the podium. Mobile devices, tablets, and smartphones all have different display requirements. They display things differently, they interact differently. Maps need to be designed accordingly if they're to be used in those situations. So you need to design for your medium. If it's paper maps, is it static? Something's not going to be unchanged. That's fine. You need a fixed paper size and scale. Is it going to be high resolution? You can make it complex. You can have a lot of information. A lot of times with paper maps, the thing is, remember, is that your viewer is committed. In other words, they've went through the process of acquiring and downloading your paper map, printing it off. They're going to spend time to figure it out. And so you can do more than just one thing with that map. Your map can serve multiple purposes. Whereas if we're talking about a web map, they're interactive. The ability to view them may vary by device. A lot of times poor light or bright light has a lot of impacts on mobile devices. You also remember, you're talking about a transient attention span with people who are on a mobile device or a tablet. They may not be as committed, if you will, as somebody who has went through the hassle of printing off a map. And so they typically have a shorter attention span. Other things are competing for the attention. So they're looking at your map, they get a ding, someone sent them a message, something's happening on the gram. One of their dating apps is just lit up. Who knows? So if you're making a web map, your rule should be what I call the one finger rule. You hold up one finger and ask people if they know what's the first thing that they should do, and you tell them it's this, and you hold up one finger and they say, what's that? He says, it's the one thing that matters the most. That's what you need to do first. It's the one thing. And so when you make a web map, it should do the one thing. So whatever that map is about, make sure it does that really well. Don't worry about the other stuff. Make sure you take care of the one thing. Again, and then it leads us back to our iterative process of how we work through the various process of designing and developing a map. So let's talk about it a little bit more. Selecting the data layers. Good maps tell stories. You have to figure out what are the lead players, what are the supporting roles. Do some layers distract from the story or obscure it? This is important. What this means is, think about your map like it's telling a story. The thing that draws the most attention on the map is the thing that matters the most. It's the lead. Other things can support that and help it. That should be included. Things that make it less obvious, complicated, and difficult to understand, those are things that distract, and they don't belong. Should you omit some data? This is always a good question. Sometimes there are privacy issues. Publishing things like parcel ownership names is important, and in some cases it's necessary. In other cases it is completely inappropriate. Sensitive information, every time they find a new giant T-Rex dinosaur somewhere in the desert, they never say where. Reason? Poaching. If people know that there's been a new find in an area, these locations are typically remote, and people just don't have access or the ability to spend time there continuously monitoring the site. So they'll go back every year and do more work when they can during their field seasons. But the rest of the time, the sites remain basically abandoned. If you publish that information, ne'er-do-wells will find the location and steal stuff. Pipelines, climate stations, if you don't want, climate change radicals or anti-carbon energy types to go out and destroy equipment, to vandalize stuff, and you don't publish the location of pipelines or where people are actively working. Similarly with climate stations, the moment you see something shiny and new and no one's around, as a kid, one of your first instincts is probably to throw a rock at it or go up and kick it. The less people can find it, the less of these things you got to worry about. There can also be unintended economic consequences that go along with some of the things that we have when we publish data. I'll give you an example. California, say that some geologists are proposing new additional faults that they think will become more prominent and active in terms of earthquakes in the coming years. If you were to map out those and show which parcels it intersected and provided the information so that people who were looking to buy new homes could find this, you're thinking, wow, I'm doing a great service to home buyers. Yes. You're also doing a great disservice to the people that own that property who might be trying to sell it. Think back to what I said very carefully. Proposed faults that may suffer earthquakes in the future from one geologist, one seismologist, one scientist. It's one person's opinion, and you just upset the economic engine of all these landowners, and it might be not even the case that these faults are going to be active or real. So there could be economic loss for those people. There could be gain for people who are not near those faults. You have to weigh all that before you make those kind of things. Publishing water test results of private wells. You start getting into risky situations when you do this, because maybe one person's well is contaminated, but maybe it's not so much the well as it is the plumbing in the house, and so all of a sudden you publish test results that show more lead in a certain community. Maybe there's more lead in one house in a certain community. What will that do to the value of the other homes? Just things to remember. Sometimes it's best to not share all the data. Selecting things within layers. Sometimes you need to simplify data for a better performance of a map. We call this cartographic generalization. You can adapt large-scale data to smaller-scale stuff. You can, for example, if you need only certain types of highways, you can select those and export them and not the others. You can modify your data in any number of ways to only show part of the data set, because maybe only part of the data set applies to the particulars of the map that you're making. You can do queries to figure out subsets. For example, if you look at earthquakes, it makes it look like California shakes like a bed in a cheap motel, but in reality, if you query that to only show earthquakes above 6.0, and you can see actually it's not even California. You couldn't tell where it was in the first map, but in the second one you can see that it's Chile, and that there is still a lot of activity along the coastal zone, but it doesn't look nearly as bad as what it does when you compare all the quakes greater than 4.0. Cartographic generalization, we briefly mentioned that. You can refine features, you can simplify features, you can aggregate features, you can collapse stuff, you can reclassify your data, you can typify data, you can displace things and exaggerate stuff. These are all ways that we make our data more basic, more simple, more understandable. Selecting a projection actually has a lot to do with this as well. If you have data that's in a geographic coordinate system, two-dimensional maps will appear dramatically distorted. Whereas if you use a projected coordinate system, they look more appropriate in terms of what we would expect. Certain projections create distortions. Certain kinds of distortions will be bad for certain maps in certain situations. So you want to select a projection that limits distortions that would impact your analysis. Conic, cylindrical, azimuthal, shape and direction, distance or area, distance or area. That's what they preserve. If shape or direction matters, cylindrical projections work well. If distance or area matters, conic. Same with azimuthal. Unintended consequences. Projection choice may affect the story. Mercator maps make the northern hemisphere look more important. The classic example is Greenland. Greenland appears to be almost the size of Africa, when in fact Africa is 17 times larger than Greenland. That is because of the northern hemisphere bias of Mercator projections. Look at maps and you ask yourself, what's the story? When you look at a map like this, what is the story? Who knows? the design of this map doesn't specifically help you. It doesn't signal out, hey, this is what I'm about, this is what my message is. It doesn't use convention or connotation to lend the user of the map to understand it. Let's talk a little bit about gradical grids. The north arrow is not appropriate for some projections. Okay, here's what we're talking about. In a conic projection, everything's curved. And so on the image on the right, you can see how the lines of longitude and latitude don't form clever little squares, and how the spaces between the lines change, at least between the north-south lines change as you move from north to south. So where would you place a north arrow on that map on the right? You would place it on any line that runs north-south, and it would be directly on that line, and that would be fine. The problem is it's only correct where you place it, because on one side of the map, north leans to the right. On the other side of the map, north leans to the left. So you don't use north arrows in a conic projection. You use a gradical grid. There are other types of grids we use in maps as well. We can have measured grids like the UTM meters grid. We can have reference grids so that we can signal out all the thing you're looking for is in 3D or 5E. Again, how we select, how we arrange, how we symbolize, review, and edit our data helps us work our way around towards making a better product. Let's talk about arrange. Visual hierarchy. In order for it's the order in which the reader perceives the different objects in a design. A good map establishes a clear pathway that highlights the important aspects. So we're going to look at a slide here for a little bit and then go on to the next slide. But basically, with visual hierarchy, it's that the thing that matters needs to pop out and get your attention. Take a look at the map, check it out, see what you think, and all that. So what was the map about? What was the first thing you noticed? How did your eyes move around the map? What got your attention? So if we did the visual hierarchy right, you would have figured out what the map was about, and whatever it was about should have been the first thing you seen, and you should have looked at that pattern and how it was evolved across the map, and it should have led you in a direction that would have highlighted other information on the map that could be useful in understanding what was going on. So how do we establish a visual hierarchy? Visual center, the rule of thirds, balance, alignment, negative space, neat lines, symbolization, color, contrast, size and thickness, foreground, background. These are all just ways of doing that. The visual center is not the center of the map. It's usually just slightly above. It's higher than the geometric center. Maps tend to look a little heavy, but if you move that up a bit, they tend to look better. Rule of thirds is something that comes from the composition rules for photography, and it basically means that if you look at that image on the left, you see the circles. Those circles are at the intersections of thirds. A third of the way across, 2/3 of the way across, a third of the way down, 2/3 of the way down. And so when you look at one of those areas, the combinations, gives you 4 points on that screen. Those are the 4 locations where the thing that you're interested in needs to be. Never right in the middle. A little to the left, a little to the right, a little up, or a little down. As long as you do one of those, things tend to look like a better picture. Notice the image on the right with people standing on top of the mound right in the middle of the picture. What happens when you move them down to the left to where that circle is? It just looks better. And that's what the rule of thirds is. Alignment. You need to make things look professional and neat, and then we do this by adding neat lines around our boxes and then making sure that those lines align. Okay, so it's not just enough to have a border on the box. The 2 boxes need to line up to one another, and so keeping those things lined up, the same size, the same spaces between things, all that are little details that certain people who have tendencies to spot those kind of things and be distracted by them will then not have problems, instead be able to analyze your map. Negative space is the unused portion of your map space. Your map should not fill up everything. Okay, don't crowd stuff together. But don't leave big empty spaces. Okay, it should be like a well-designed flower bed. You need to fill things in, but don't fill things up. Look at that top map. You've got a small title. You've got Alaska up there into that top left. It looks hideous. You've got a box down there in the bottom right that you can't read. All your other stuff is jammed together in the bottom left, and you've just got this huge waste of space in the bottom middle and most of the top where you have the title. Or if you look at the map below, we left some white space. We didn't fill everything up, but we utilized it much more effectively. We put the scale bar and the north arrow in the bottom corner, which, by the way, north arrow shouldn't be there. Why? Conic projection should have gradical grids or nothing. Legends are better. Still kind of wasting space in that bottom right box. We could have increased the font size of the legend or that and made those more useful. Balancing elements. Balancing elements, I should have maybe said a bit more. You want to sort of place things out across the map to try to keep it balanced. And let's talk about symbolizing stuff. Different ways to symbolize: color, contrast, foreground, size, whatever. All these things help us, lend ways of differentiating from one thing to another. Ask yourself what stands out and why. So we have different colors and we have different boxes, and what draws your attention. If you look at A, the contrast between the light orange and the dark orange in the bottom right box is more pronounced than the contrast between the dark blue and the medium blue. When you look at B, the thicknesses of the lines and the texture, the dotted line versus solid line, they all really jump out. Same way with the other boxes. There's some elements there of color, contrast, foreground, size, spacing, symbols, fonts that all make one or the other more prominent. The brain does not just observe, it tries to find patterns. I tell students all the time that biologically we have evolved to be the greatest pattern detection algorithm in the history of time, because those of us who could not see the large predatory animals hiding in the grass about to eat us were eaten, and the ones who looked at the grass and said, there's something moving in the grass doesn't look right, I think I saw something, ooh, is that the eye of a tiger or a lion or a bear, oh my, whatever it was, we've found that it's better to overestimate a pattern and think there's a pattern when there's not a pattern, because the thing that the pattern is something's wrong and I survive, and if I think something's wrong, there's nothing wrong, I still survive. If I don't think there's anything wrong and it's a tiger, I get eaten. So if we follow that logic, we're really great at identifying patterns, but we're also really good at identifying patterns that aren't there. And so that's why we use statistics to remove that human element from that decision. Visual hierarchy has to do with what's in front. The one on the top makes it look like the grid's important because it's over top of everything, where the one on the bottom, the grid is a tertiary concern at best, and most likely it's really not even noticed. Base maps are important, but if you're going to use visual hierarchy and you want the things that you're mapping to show more prominence, they need to have much more contrast in the base map. Here we have this base map of waterways and terrain, and if our data is the highway layers, then they need to be a much more bold in color so that they show up clearly in the forefront. So let's talk about reviewing and editing. You want to check your balance, your visual hierarchy. You want to print it to see if the colors look right as a paper map. You want to always look for spelling, grammar, and details, things I hate to do. And then you want to remember your sources and make sure that somewhere in your map environment that you've listed where the data came from and who put the map together. Pay attention to the details. Little things like not having adequate space around your legend, not having commas and having really crappy formatting for your numbers, using abbreviated titles that were great for your table of contents like Pop 1990 is not the same as having a legend with things like 1990 population, or having a name like cities.shp, which is perfectly fine for your table of contents, but US cities is what should say in the legend. Make these changes. It looks better. It makes the map better. It helps people understand better. Here's a map to review. Things that I see wrong right off the top of my head. Colors on the map are horrible. Rivers, lakes, and states, you can barely make out any of that stuff. The title is too small. The drop shadow on the title is too big. The little text insert at the bottom is just horrific. There's nothing there that I necessarily need to see. It is put together with Justify font, and it doesn't have enough of it, and things come in and it's full of incomplete sentences. The north arrow is right in the middle, and it probably shouldn't be there ever. The mile marker, scale bar is probably okay, except that we've loaded up the bottom with all this stuff. It makes the bottom of the map look heavy. We have Alaska up there in the far top left. That's not relevant, or if it is relevant, then it needs to be in a different design of map, because you can't make hide nor hair of that up there. Lots wrong with it. Much better map design, but not perfect. We have the household sizes. Our legend is kind of skewy. The text across the bottom is not bad, but we don't have any other real feature information there. But all in all, it's a decent map. It's a lot better than the last one. External review is important. It's very helpful to have other people look at your maps. Remember, maps are like babies. Everyone's baby's pretty, especially to them. If you want to find out if other people think your baby's pretty, you got to let them see it. They won't tell you the truth, but if we're not talking about babies and we're talking about maps, they will. Ask people that matter. Ask people that you trust. Ask people in your field. Ask people who are similar to your audience. And if all else fails, ask a graphic designer. They can take a look at what you've done and say, yeah, this is a pretty good layout. This makes sense. I like this. I understand it. They're going to give you suggestions, and they're just that, suggestions. Just because somebody else doesn't like something or thinks it should be different does not mean you have to change it. It only means that you need to do your due diligence and to consider their statements and decide whether or not you agree. And if you agree, make those changes. And if you don't, leave it alone. 3-second test. Look at the map on the next slide for 5 to 4 seconds. I hate doing these. We'll just do I'm just going to go to the next slide and look at it and go on. Didn't really like it. Didn't pop out at me. If you look at it longer, you might make out more what it's about. Not every map can be dissolved in that amount of time, so you need to, again, it depends on the audience, it depends on the setting, it depends on the use. There's so much that goes into this. I think an exercise like this at times can be a challenge. So how do we edit and improve our maps? You want to concentrate the message. Don't try to say too much. Figure out what that one thing is that matters and make sure it does it really well. Simplify stuff. Things that are complicated and irrelevant need to be made simple or gone. It's nothing wrong with trying different colors in different contexts to see if you can make the map better. Test it under the conditions of use. Don't sit there and spend 4 hours making a beautiful colored choropleth map and then realize that it's for an audience of colorblind people and just say, well, I'll print it in black and white. It doesn't work that way. If you're making a black and white map, make a black and white map. If you're making a color map, make a color map. If it's going to be printed, evaluate it in its printed form. If it's going to be online, evaluate it online. If it's going to be used by cell phones, evaluate it on a cell phone. If it's going to be shot on a projector from overhead to a screen, see what it looks like in that environment. Can't make this point clear enough. you have to know, above all else, what you're trying to map, who you're trying to show, and how they're going to get it. If you know what you're trying to tell them and who you're trying to tell it to and where they're going to read it or see it, if you can make decisions that accompany those conditions, then you will make a better map. So that'll get you all back to the beginning, and you might even be done, or it may be time to add more data and work your way around again.